Hi everyone, I'm Glenn, and welcome to the first episode of Craftman's Corner. In this episode, we're going to be going over Easel and its new Pro 3D carving feature. This new feature has some pros and has some cons, so there'll be some workarounds that we're going to have to do to kind of get around some of these issues that we'll kind of come across. The first episode will be going over carving a new clock. This clock is a Piret clock. It's pretty cool. So let's kind of dive into it. Okay, so the first problem that we came across when dealing with Easel 3D carving is file size. It seems that Easel doesn't like to import a file that's bigger than about 100 megabytes. So in order to simplify the mesh, I went with this My Mini Factory mesh simplification application. I'll go ahead and leave a link to the GitHub below. Now we can just go ahead and scroll this back to about 100 megabytes. Anything over 100 megs, it will reject. Anything below 100 megs, it will accept. And remember, the larger the file is, the more detail the file is going to have, and the more time it's going to take for your 3D carving to complete the final 3D pass. And then all you have to do is just click right here to download it. And I've already done that, so let's go ahead and switch back over to Easel here. So now when we jump in Easel, we have a pretty good idea of what this image is going to look like. Now let's go over a few different things here inside of Easel. We went with a 11.5 inch X and a 18 inch Y axis piece of birch. Now this piece of birch is pretty thick. It's actually a 1.7 inch thick piece, and that was after planing it down to level both sides. Okay, now let's go ahead and go on to placement of the STL. I eventually went with a 0.9 inch depth into the wood. Okay, now for the cut style, I decided to go with a rectangular relief, and what that will allow is us to be able to carve out the top of the material and leave the bottom as a base. Now the material itself is sitting about 0.9 inches away from the bottom. That will leave us almost an inch of base to work with. And then I went ahead and centered the clock to the material that we're working with. In this case, the clock ended up being around 10 inches by 17.35 inches. Okay, now let's talk about the Z height. So the Z height ultimately was set to 0.7, and that gave us a pretty good relief for this design. That may change for the design that you're working with, so you kind of just have to play around with this setting and kind of see what looks good. And you also have to take into account the bit that you're using. If you're using a straight bit, you don't have to worry too much, but if you're using a V-bit or some type of ball-nosed tapered bit, then you kind of have to worry about how deep you make this so that the bit itself does not interfere with the model. Now, depending on the STL file that you have, you may have to orient it different. This file here was oriented on the top orientation. So now with rectangle relief, it gives you the option of depth of cut as well as the padding around the actual image. So with the depth of cut, we decided to go 1 inch into the material from the top all the way down to this bottom cut here, which will give us a really nice contour for this outer edge. Now, when working with different woods, you want to mill this finishing pass with the grain. So in this case, if the grain is going in this direction, you're going to want to mill in that direction. If the grain happens to go in the opposite direction, you're going to want to mill in that direction. It helps hide some of the imperfections or tear out that may happen. Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about the roughing pass. I went ahead and used a carbide tip down cut to flute 1/4 inch cutting bit on this. For the cut settings, I went with a feed rate of around 72 inches a minute, with a plunge rate of around 15 inches a minute, and a step over of 40%, with a depth per pass of around 2.5 inches. For the finishing bit, I went with something quite a bit smaller. I went with a 1/16 inch tapered ball nose end bit. Now, when trying to actually generate the tool paths, I get a warning message telling me that any model that's greater than 12 by 12 inches may have very long carve times. But in this case, it does not mention that there may be an issue of running out of memory on some browsers. Now, if I went ahead and continued while I was inside of Chrome, I would run into a problem. I would have an issue where I would run out of memory. Now, to get over this issue, I decided to go with Firefox since it does not have this memory issue. But even then, I still had issues when trying to actually carve the piece and send the G-code to the Xcarve itself. To overcome this issue, I went ahead and actually downloaded the G-code itself by download G-code zip. Now, after downloading the G-code file, I was able to import G-code, and then I was actually able to carve the model itself. Okay, now that we've actually loaded into Firefox here and imported the G-code that we've saved, it looks a little bit different, but from here we have more direct control over the machine itself. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump into the time lapse of the carve. So anytime you decide to go ahead and stain a piece of wood, it's good to use a pre-stained wood conditioner. I decided to go with a water-based stain, so I went with a water-based stain conditioner. It just helps fill the grain of the wood and make sure that you have a good even stain throughout.